Prussic acid.
Prussic acid.
Pry.
Pry.
I don't want to pry, but I need to ask you one or two questions.
Reporters prying into the affairs of celebrities.
We finally managed to pry the door open with a screwdriver.
If you want to know his name, you'll have to pry it out of her.
P.S.
P.S.
She added a P.S. to say hi to my brother.
Best wishes, Julie. P.S. Maggie sends her love.
Psalm.
Psalm.
Psalmist.
Psalmist.
Psalter.
Psalter.
Psaltery.
Psaltery.
Psephology.
Psephology.
Sued.
Sued.
Pseudo.
Pseudo-intellectuals.
She dismisses astrology as pseudoscience.
Pseudonym.
Pseudonym.
He wrote under the pseudonym Silchester.
He was the pseudonymous author.
Psoriasis.
Psoriasis.
Psst.
Psst.
Psst. Guess what? P.S.T.
P.S.T.
Psych.
Psych.
We both knew we had to psych ourselves up for the race. I'm a psych major now.
Psyche.
Psyche.
Freud's account of the human psyche.
A characteristic of the feminine psyche is to seek approval from others.
Psychedelic.
Psychedelic.
A psychedelic light show.
Fashion designers look back to the 1960s with dazzling psychedelic prints.
60s psychedelia. Psychiatric.
Psychiatric.
A psychiatric hospital.
A psychiatric nurse.
Charles was suffering from a psychiatric disorder.
Psychiatrist.
Psychiatrist.
Psychiatry.
Psychiatry.
Psychic.
Psychic.
A spiritual healer with psychic powers.
A documentary on psychic phenomena.
You don't have to be psychic to know what Maggie is thinking.
Psychic disorders.
Psycho.
Psycho.
Psycho. A psychoanalyst.
Psychoactive.
Psychoactive.
Psychoanalyst.
Psychoanalyst.
Psychoanalyze.
Psychoanalyze.
Psychoanalysis.
Psychoanalysis.
Psychoanalytic theory.
Psychobabble.
Psychobabble.
Psychobiology.
Psychobiology.
Psychodrama.
Psychodrama.
Psychokinesis.
Psychokinesis. Psychokinesis.
Psychological.
Psychological.
Sleep disorders are a serious psychological problem.
Freud's psychological theories.
What was the patient's psychological state?
Max says he's ill, but I'm sure it's psychological. Psychologically disturbed patients.
Psychologist.
Psychologist.
A clinical psychologist.
Psychology.
Psychology.
Experts in the field of developmental psychology.
Research into the psychology of racism.
The psychology of 3-year-olds.
Mob psychology.
You have to use psychology to get people to stop smoking.
Psychometric.
Psychometric.
Psychometric tests.
Psychopath.
Psychopath.
A psychopathic personality.
Psychosis.
Psychosis.
Psychosomatic.
Psychosomatic.
Children are just as susceptible to psychosomatic conditions as adults. Children are just as susceptible to psychosomatic conditions as adults.
Psychotherapy.
Psychotherapy.
Psychotic.
Psychotic.
Psychotic patients.
Psychotic illness. Like most psychotics, she was very dependent on others. Psychotropic.
Psychotropic.
Port Moresby. Port Moresby.
PT.
PT.
A PT instructor. PT lessons at school.
PTA.
An active member of the PTA.
Pterodactyl.
Pterodactyl. Pterodactyl.
PTO.
PTO.
Ptomaine.
Domain.
PTSD. PTSD.
P2P. P2P. P2P payments.
Australian wine growers Pty.
Pub.
Pub.
Do you fancy going to the pub?
A pub lunch.
The pub landlord.
Pub crawl.
Pub crawl.
A Saturday night pub crawl.
Puberty.
Puberty.
14 is a fairly normal age for a girl to reach puberty.
Pubes. Pubes.
Pubescent.
Pubescent.
Pubic.
Pubic.
Pubic hair.
Public.
Public.
We have to show that publishing this story is in the public interest.
Full public access to information.
Public opinion is gradually shifting in favor of the imprisoned men.
There was a public outcry about the shooting.
Their activities have been hidden from the public gaze. Their activities have been hidden from the public gaze.
A public telephone.
A public footpath.
Proposals to ban smoking in public places.
A public library.
The government's public spending plans. We do not believe he is fit for public office.
Efforts to control public expenditure. Efforts to control public expenditure.
Public funding for the arts.
Details of the highly sensitive information have not been made public.
Although not a public figure, he was a man of great influence.
Today the school finds itself in the midst of a very public debate.
She was acutely embarrassed by his public display of temper. She was acutely embarrassed by his public display of temper.
There will be a public inquiry into the sinking of the oil tanker. A fear of public speaking. Let's go somewhere less public where we can talk.
Howard seems to have retired from public life.
Attempts to improve the public image of the police.
The planners are almost ready to go public on the road building scheme. The planners are almost ready to go public on the road building scheme.
Many partnerships went public in the 1980s to secure extra capital.
She is paid £10,000 for the briefest of public appearances.
It is a job that brings him constantly into the public eye.
The army was called out to protect public property.
Our lives seem to have become public property.
Drugs have become public enemy number one.
The meeting will be open to the general public.
Police warned members of the public not to approach the man who may be armed. Police warned members of the public not to approach the man who may be armed.
On the whole, the public is conservative about education.
Her husband was always nice to her in public.
He is adored by his public.
The theatre-going public are very demanding. Public access channel.
Public access channel.
Public address system.
Public address system.
Public affairs.
Public affairs.
He took an active part in public affairs.
Publican.
Publican.
Publication.
Publication.
She was in England for the publication of her new book.
He spent his holiday writing reviews for publication.
He was the author of 70 major scientific publications.
A weekly publication.
The publication of the company's annual results.
Public bar.
Public bar.
Public company.
Public company.
Public convenience.
Public convenience.
Public corporation.
Public corporation.
Public defender.
Public defender.
Public domain.
Public domain.
The information is not currently in the public domain.
Public domain software is sometimes called shareware.
Public health.
Public health.
A danger to public health.
Public house.
Public house.
Public holiday.
Public holiday.
Public housing.
Public housing.
Publicist.
Publicist.
Publicity.
Publicity.
Standards in education have received much publicity over the last few years.
It's important to gain good publicity for the school.
The adverse publicity had damaged sales.
Who's going to do the show's publicity? Who's going to do the show's publicity?
The government has launched a publicity campaign.
Is there much reported romance just a publicity stunt?
Publicize.
Publicize.
Television's failure to publicise the unemployment issue.
His visit was highly publicised.
Public limited company.
Public limited company.
Publicly.
Publicly.
She and her family agreed never to discuss the matter publicly.
A publicly funded health service.
Publicly elected bodies.
Public nuisance.
Public nuisance.
Public nuisance. Public opinion.
Public opinion.
Public opinion is shifting in favor of the new law.
The pressure of public opinion. Public ownership.
Public ownership.
The opposition intends to bring the industry back into public ownership.
Public prosecutor.
Public prosecutor.
Public relations.
Public relations.
They ran their own successful public relations business in London. The project has been disastrous for the bank in terms of public relations.
A public relations exercise.
Public school.
Public school.
Public sector.
Public sector.
A job in the public sector.
Public sector workers.
Public sector housing.
Public servant.
Public servant.
Public service.
Public service.
Efforts to improve quality in public services.
Local TV stations ran the ads as a public service.
Staff cuts in the public service.
He left the public service and embarked on a career in the city.
Public spirited.
Public spirited.
Any public-spirited citizen would have done the same.
Public television.
Public television.
Public transport. Public transport.
Public utility.
Public utility.
Public works.
Public works.
The Public Works Department.
Publish.
Publish.
The first edition was published in 1765.
They are publishing the dictionary on CD-ROM.
We love reading your letters, and we try to publish as many as possible.
The latest unemployment figures will be published tomorrow.
University teachers must publish regularly to gain promotion.
Publisher.
Publisher.
Publishing.
Publishing.
Tony wants to get a job in publishing. A new publishing house.
Puce.
Puce.
Park.
Puck.
Pucker.
Pucker.
Her mouth puckered, and she started to cry.
Puckish.
Puckish.
A puckish grin.
Pud.
Pud.
What's for pud?
Pudding.
Pudding.
Chocolate pudding.
There's ice cream for pudding. Steak and kidney pudding. Pudding basin.
Pudding basin.
Puddle.
Puddle.
Children splashed through the puddles.
He had fallen asleep, his head resting in a puddle of beer. Rain trickled down the glass, puddling on the windowsills.
Pudendum.
Pudendum.
Pudgy.
Pudgy.
The baby's pudgy little legs.
Pueblo.
Pueblo.
Puerile.
Puerile.
A puerile joke.
Puff.
Puff.
George puffed and panted as he tried to keep up.
An old man puffed up to them.
He caught up with Gary, puffing for breath.
Kinane sat in silence, puffing thoughtfully at his pipe. Steam puffed out of the chimney.
The boiler was puffing thick black smoke.
Don't puff smoke into my face.
The train puffed steadily across the bridge.
Henry puffed out his chest proudly.
The pastry will puff up while it bakes.
Birds puff up their feathers to keep warm.
My eye had puffed up because of a mosquito bite.
He laughed and took a puff on his cigar.
The dragon disappeared in a puff of smoke.
I was out of puff.
Puffball.
Puffball.
Puffed.
Puffed.
I'm too puffed to dance anymore.
Puffed up.
Puffed up.
I was so puffed up with my own importance in those days.
Puffer.
Puffer.
Asthma can be made worse by using puffers too often.
Puffin.
Puffin.
Puff pastry.
Puff pastry.
Puffy.
Puffy.
Her eyes were puffy from crying.
Puffy white clouds.
Pug.
Pug.
Pugilist.
Pugilist.
Pugnacious.
Pugnacious.
The professor had been pugnacious and irritable.
Puke.
Puke.
He puked all over the carpet.
That kind of greed makes me puke.
Pukey.
Pukey.
Pucker.
Pucker.
Pucker food.
Pulchritude.
Pulchritude.
Pulitzer Prize.
Pulitzer Prize.
Pull.
Pull.
Mom! Davy's pulling my hair.
He pulled her down into her seat.
She pulled open the door and hurried inside.
She has to have 2 teeth pulled.
Vicky had pulled the arm off her doll.
A tractor pulling a trailer.
He pulled out his wallet and said, "Let me pay."
Ben pulled a pen from his pocket. He pulled off his damp shirt.
She tried to pull her hand free, but it was held fast.
She struggled fiercely, trying to pull her arm out of his grasp.
She pulled away from him.
Benny pulled himself up from the floor with difficulty.
Paul pulled a muscle trying to lift the freezer.
Francis pulled strings to get him out of trouble.
It was widely believed that Montague was secretly pulling the strings behind the Prime Minister. It was widely believed that Montague was secretly pulling the strings behind the Prime Minister.
The gang have pulled another bank robbery.
He was trying to pull a fast one when he told you he'd paid.
Don't you ever pull a stunt like that again?
I haven't won, have I? You're pulling my leg.
Your dad's a racing driver. Pull the other one.
She raised the gun and pulled the trigger.
It was already getting dark, so he pulled the curtains.
Muhammad Ali can still pull the crowds.
The city's reputation for a clean environment has pulled new residents from other states.
He knew he could pull any girl he wanted.
They pulled the concert.
She pulled the car into a side street.
The bus pulled to a halt.
Getting him to do his homework is like pulling teeth.
The barman laughed and began to pull a couple of pints. The barman laughed and began to pull a couple of pints.
Schumacher pulled ahead of Montoya as the 2 drivers approached the first corner of the race.
Pull the meat apart with 2 forks.
His drinking pulled the family apart.
The selection committee pulled each proposal apart. Mary was pulling nervously at her hair.
He pulled hard on the cigarette.
He waved as he pulled away.
Nukuku is pulling away from the other runners.
In the end, he pulled back from financing the film. Many banks are pulling back from international markets.
They are preparing to pull back their forces.
Our play improved and we pulled back 2 goals. Our play improved and we pulled back 2 goals.
My old school was pulled down.
Real estate stocks pulled down total returns of 35.7%.
Her problems have really pulled her down.
The crowd were pulling for me to do well.
She pulled in to let the ambulance pass. She pulled in to let the ambulance pass.
A publicity stunt to pull in the crowds.
The goalkeeper pulled off 6 terrific saves.
We pulled off the road to get some food.
Don't pull out, there's something coming. I pulled out to overtake a bus.
McDermott pulled out with an injury at the last minute.
They are trying to pull out of the agreement.
He threatened to pull his son out of the team.
Jim saw that the firm was going to be ruined, so he pulled out. Most of the troops have been pulled out.
When the country was still pulling out of a recession.
The policeman signalled to him to pull over. He pulled the car over.
A cop pulled him over and gave him a speeding ticket.
His injuries are severe, but he's expected to pull through.
He relied on his experience to pull him through.
If we all pull together, we'll finish on time.
With an effort, Mary pulled herself together. We need an experienced manager to pull the department together.
He pulled up in front of the gates.
I felt I had to pull her up on her lateness.
He gave her a sharp pull forward.
The gravitational pull of the moon.
After about a year, I gave in to the pull of fatherhood.
His family's name gives him a lot of pull in this town.
It was a long pull up the hill.
A groin pull.
She took a long pull on her cigarette.
He popped the ring pull on another can of lager.
Pullback.
Pullback.
A significant pullback in the stock market.
Pull-down menu.
Pull-down menu.
Pull it.
Pull it.
Pulley.
Pulley.
Pulling power.
Pulling power.
Madonna's pulling power filled the arena for 10 nights.
Pullman.
Pullman.
Pull on.
Pull on.
Pull out.
Pull out.
The pull-out of troops will begin soon. A pull-out on home PCs.
Pull over.
Pull over.
Pull tab.
Pull tab.
Pull up.
Pull up.
Pulp.
Pulmonary.
Pulmonary.
Pulp.
Pulp.
Mash the bananas to a pulp.
Timber grown for wood pulp.
A soft pulp of leaves and mud.
Halve the melon and scoop out the pulp.
An ad in a pulp magazine. Pulp fiction.
Cook slowly until soft and pulpy.
Pulped apples. His body was pulped by the impact of the train.
Unsold novels are sent to be pulped. Wood pulping techniques.
Pulpit.
Pulpit.
Reverend Dawson addressed the congregation from the pulpit.
Pulsar.
Pulsar.
Pulsate.
Pulsate.
I could see the veins in his neck pulsating.
Pulsating music.
The whole city seemed to pulsate with excitement.
Pulsation.
Pulsation.
The pulsations of the baby's heart.
Muscular pulsation.
Pulse.
Pulse.
His breathing was shallow and his pulse was weak.
The doctor listened to his breathing and checked his pulse.
I held his wrist, trying to find a pulse.
She felt his neck. There was no pulse.
If your pulse rate is between 90 and 100, it is likely that you are unfit.
Her pulse raced with excitement.
The distant pulse of a steel band. Clinton had an uncanny ability to sense the pulse of the nation.
She felt the blood pulsing through her veins.
Coloured lights pulsed in time to the music.
Excitement pulsed through the crowd.
Pulse several times until the mixture looks like oatmeal.
Pulverize.
Pulverize.
The seeds can be used whole or pulverized into flour. Stuart completely pulverized the opposition.
Pulverized coal.
Puma.
Puma.
Pumice.
Pumice.
Pommel.
Pommel.
Diane leaned over and pummeled the pillows. She flew at him, pummeling his chest with her fists. The cook pummeled at the dough. The platoon was pummeled by heavy machine gun fire.
Pump.
Pump.
A pair of leather pumps.
The fire department is still pumping flood water out of the cellars.
We were able to pump clean water from several of the wells.
You got a job pumping gas for the hotel guests.
My heart was pumping fast. The furnaceman's job was to pump away furiously at the bellows.
Blood pumped from the wound.
I tried to pump him for information about their other contacts.
Athletes pumped full of steroids. Music pumped out from the loudspeakers.
Propaganda pumped out by the food industry.
You'll have to pump the boat out.
The U.S. was able to pump up exports.
Come on, pump up the volume.